Great. We'll give folks a few more minutes to mosey in. In the meantime, I'll just go ahead and give my normal spiel at the beginning. Welcome. You have found yourself in the NSGIC 3DEP for the Nation interest group meeting. These are open meetings to members of the public, federal government, state governments, private sector, anyone and everyone interested in 3D elevation program activity throughout the United States. I'm your host, Jordan Regine, and today we've got a really awesome presentation lined up. Go ahead and pop over to the agenda as folks mosey in. You won't miss too much. So we've hit the welcome. We'll have a USGS update today. We do have some news from the USGS side of things. I'll run through some project updates, let you guys know what we've been working on in the 3DEP for the Nation project, which is a cooperative agreement between the National States Geospatial Information Council and the USGS 3DEP program. So we serve the function of kind of creating an interface between federal and state governments to collaborate and share ideas and just align folks with the USGS 3D elevation program and the activities across the country. Really, our mission is to support states in their elevation activities, specifically with regard to 3D elevation programs. So I'll give a few project updates, the things that we've been working on over the last couple of months. Then I want to make space for open opportunity for updates on 3DEP specific items. So whether you're a state or a private company or an individual, if you've got stuff that you're working on or just want to give a shout out in appreciation for 3DEP data that you've been using, we'd love to hear those. I've got a couple of reminders, and then we'll get into the meat of today's info group. Chris Crosby from OpenTopography is here, and he's going to be speaking about the value of multi-temporal data. Really excited about this one. Multi-temporal data is, I think, is like the crown of data types, and it's particularly difficult to work with those large data sets. So really excited to have Chris here with us today. So we've given folks plenty of time to move in, and thank you, Lindsay, for keeping an eye as more folks might move in. We'll go ahead and get started with a USGS update. I know we've got a few folks from the USGS acquisition team on the call with us today. I'm not sure who wants to start, Sue or Michelle or Chris. Go ahead and take it over.
I will hop on and do that last bullet, and then Michelle, if you wanted to speak to the mapping coordination site, we can have you hop on for that one. I think the important thing is why am I talking? So many of you know there's been a lot of changes recently in federal government in general, and in the USGS. Brian Hadley is leaving federal service. He's not officially left, but he's also out on a family emergency, so he's kind of got a lot on his plate right now. So going forward, I will be taking over Brian's data acquisition role as the 3DEP data acquisition lead, in addition to my day job as the 3DHP data acquisition lead. So I'm happy to be back. For those of you who don't know, I acted in this role for a couple of years, I think, starting about 2020. So knowing that we're kind of readjusting with all the changes that are happening with our team and with workloads, please have a little patience with us as we kind of adjust for that and our additional workloads. But we will do our best to be as responsive to you guys as we can going forward. And please, if you have something that question that you need answered right away, please don't hesitate to nag and tell me that you need an answer right away. So again, happy to be back. And Michelle, are you on? Did you want to say anything about the mapping coordination site?
I don't know if I need to say much more than I put into the update there. The mapping coordination site is run by NOAA. It shows, it's supposed to show existing data, current FY projects, and priorities, upcoming priorities. It looks great, but the content they're still working on. So we look forward to seeing that get finished, and all the agencies. I think states will be able to input data. It should be a good site.
It should be. It's looking good. Thanks, Michelle. And I'll call Chris. Did you have any updates for the group or no?
Yeah, I'll mention that, as you said, hi everyone, Chris Cortini, also in the National Geospatial Program at USGS. I'm in the user engagement section, which is our group of national map liaisons. We've had a number of changes there as well with recent retirements. So I'm going to paste into the chat our current coverage. So for those of you who work with liaisons or looking for your current point of contact, check out that link and you'll find all the latest info. And as Sue said, liaisons are also getting used to new assignments in some cases. So yeah, appreciate your grace and your patience as we go through that. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And I guess the last thing, we kind of went backwards on this slide, but you know, that's how we roll. The DCA project awards listed here are projects have been awarded. We are moving forward with as many projects and awards as we can. We are still awaiting final budget numbers. I know the federal budget was passed in March, but with a lot of changes and a lot of stuff trickling down from department to agency and beyond. We're still waiting for our final numbers to be able to move forward with some projects. So again, we beg your patience and we appreciate that from you. I think that's it, Jordan.
Awesome. Thank you, Sue. Glad to have you back. Excited to work with you and continue towards our 100% baseline coverage for the US for 3DEP data. Thank you, Chris and Michelle. There is one thing I'd like to plug for the US mapping coordination site, and Michelle touched on it. It will be open to states. And I know we got a question in the last interest group meeting, who all it would be open to based on the webinar that we had earlier last month, I believe. It might have been, yes, it was last month at this point. It will be open to even, I believe, private folks who want to put their priority AOIs in there as well. So utilities and everyone can look in there. So looking forward to having that coordination side out there and open. And correct me if I'm wrong on that point, Michelle, please. But okay, great. Thank you, USGS team. Really excited to be moving forward with the program. On the NSGIC side of things, the 3DEP for the nation. Here are our 2025 focus areas. As always, supporting the efforts to secure sustainable funding is the top of the list. We want to make sure that we continue to produce this data, and we're here to help states in any way we can to make sure that they can bring their funding to the table. So the last couple of months in the state team meetings, we've been discussing how we might approach bringing private funding partners to the table. The program is open to federal, state, and private funding partners. So we've just been thinking about what would the value proposition be? How can we communicate that to private folks to bring them to the table? And then how would they even engage with states if that was something that they were interested in? It's very early stages of this conversation right now, no formal guidance. It's just, how do we bring more people to participate in the program from a funding perspective to really improve that sustainable funding into the future? Had some really great conversations, got some really good ideas from TomTom, as well as Overture on that topic. So looking forward to seeing that mature and working with the state team in USGS to kind of take these nebulous thoughts and put them into something in the future. We're also really working on promoting the value of 3DEP throughout the economy, working with folks like Chris and Geocom and Overture to highlight how this data is being used and how it's really making an impact, not just in saving lives, but in growing the economy and really helping our country prosper. One of the ways we're doing that is through state LiDAR highlights. Pennsylvania is published on the 3DEP for the Nation Info Hub. You can find that at nsgic.org and sgic.org. under the 3Dep for the Nation program. On deck, we've got Montana and New Jersey. Oh, sorry, Phil, I'm going real fast. What's up, Phil? I'm gonna mute Phil. Sorry. Unless you're talking to us. Oh. All right. Cool. Spoke with the teams from Montana and New Jersey over the last couple of weeks, so we'll be getting those state highlights out, and we've got Connecticut lined up as well. So really looking forward to getting these highlights in long form out in story map format. So if you are a state and you would like your state highlighted, please just drop me a message or shoot me an email, and I'll set up a time to meet with you, your team, and any stakeholders you have in your state to get a firsthand perspective on why LiDAR is important, and specifically why 3Dep activity is important in your state. And then, of course, this data would not be valuable if it wasn't shared and without all of the derivative products that flow from it. So again, highlighting interesting use cases and putting those up on the info forum and the info page is what we're here doing. So if you have interesting use cases, or if you know of anyone who's using the data in really cool ways, shoot me an email and let me know. And then looking forward to further 3D HP coordination, especially with Sue back in the 3Dep world. I anticipate that really leaning into that as we get more clarity in the federal budget around 3D HP. So that's what NSGIC is up to. And thank you. Abby, what's up?
Sorry, I don't know how that came on.
It's okay. Cool. I want to make space for anyone who's got contributions. So open updates right now. If anyone's from the state team, private sector, or federal, even folks who are using 3Dep have any updates, would love to hear them. I would like to keep these to 3Dep specific activity. Feel free to raise your hand, drop them in the chat, and I'll make a little space for that right now. All right, cool. Well, very excited for the upcoming state team meeting next week. Looking forward to working with Sue and getting back into the mix there. And then we are lining up an interest group meeting targeting the end of June or early July. I've got a few folks on deck for that, but no one specifically confirmed yet. So keep your eyes open for the next interest group meeting. This one, I believe we're looking to host a platform, places where you can find 3Dep data and integrate it into different workflows. So keep your eyes open on LinkedIn and the NSGIC communities for the next interest group meeting. So with that, really excited to have Chris Crosby, the Director of Operations and Strategy at OpenTopography, with us today. He's going to be talking about the value of multi-temporal data. So I'll go ahead and stop my share, Chris, and let you take over.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation. Can you hear me okay, everybody? And you can see my slides okay at the moment now?
I can see them now.
Okay, cool. Great. Thanks. Yeah, so I've got about 45 minutes of presentation here, and I'm going to talk about OpenTopography, which is looking at the participant list from this group here. I recognize some folks, so hopefully this is a review or a refresher. And if you're not familiar with OpenTopography, you'll hopefully kind of get a basic understanding. And then in talking to Jordan about this group and sort of potentially topics of interest, I'm going to focus kind of on some of the work we've been doing in OpenTopography, focused on processes and methods and data handling for multi-temporal analysis of LiDAR topography data, in particular, 3Dep being a very important part of that, but also just applicable really to any kind of multi-temporal topographic data you may come upon. So quickly, what is OpenTopography? This is an online portal website, spatial data infrastructure, whatever term you want to use for it, that was built now over 15 years ago with a focus on democratizing access to high resolution topography, really focused on LiDAR, and we started doing this work when LiDAR was a relatively new and emerging technology. And there weren't a lot of great platforms for data access, data discovery, and frankly, even software to support these kinds of data sets. LiDAR, in particular point cloud LiDAR data sets, has been our bread and butter, but we all are also manage and work with data sets that come from other technologies, whether that's space-based radar remote sensing, optical, photogrammetric type approaches, UAV data sets from terrestrial laser scanners. We consider all of that topography. And today I'm going to focus mostly on things you can do with airborne LiDAR, but just keep in mind that a lot of these approaches in data management, sort of things we developed over the years, are really applicable to all these kinds of data sets. This gets asked a lot, like, what is OpenTopography? It's really just a project funded by the National Science Foundation through the Geoscience Directorate. So the what's called EAR, part of the National Science Foundation. We initially got funding for this activity in 2009, but some of this work goes back to the early to mid 2000s when we were prototyping how to manage and work with LiDAR point cloud data sets. We've been fortunate to have a pretty reliable sponsor in the National Science Foundation, and this is the team of folks that work on this project. So the top row are kind of the leadership, Vishu Nandigam, who's at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, which is the University of California, San Diego, myself, who's at the EarthScope Consortium, and then Ramon and Chelsea, who are at Arizona State University. And then the bottom row are the sort of the team that work on this project. It's a relatively modestly funded effort. It's about 3.5 FTE. So everybody you see here, it's none of us, it's our full-time job. We have other responsibilities inside of our organizations. But this team's been working together for quite a while, and it's kind of a nice collaboration between sort of domain science users of these kinds of data, geospatial data expertise, and people who know how to build and maintain and run operational cyber infrastructure. And we're pretty heavily leveraged on compute and storage infrastructure that exists at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. And what OpenTopography does is basically topographic data hosting and distribution. So this is just data discovery, data access. The kind of magic sauce of OpenTopography has always been kind of the idea of co-locating data processing with data access in the browser. So we have a whole suite of tools that allow people to do basic geospatial data processing to produce the products they actually want from relatively raw data. So this is becoming more commonplace in the web and the geospatial world. But when we started doing this back in the 2000s, it was relatively novel, and still, I think, is sort of what makes OpenTopography somewhat unique in this space. In addition to the portal, we also have APIs to access data. We provide access to cloud native data sets. We've done a lot of work with Jupyter Notebooks and developing open source code. I won't talk much about these resources, but these are all available through our website. And then we have a long history of doing education and training in the use of these kinds of data sets. So lots and lots of short courses. I think we've taught like something like 40 different short courses over the years, on some of those in person, some of those online, on where these data come from, how you use them, how you apply them to various purposes. So today, as I said, I'm going to do a quick overview of OpenTopography and just what it is and sort of the status. But really, then I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about topographic differencing or intercomparison of multi-temporal data sets, because this is something we've emphasized over the last several years in OpenTopography. And we've done a fair amount of work both building tools in the browser to enable this, but also just developing methods and best practices. And then I will sort of intersperse this with some examples from various places we've done this, and then talk a little bit about conclusions and lessons learned. So everybody on this call is very familiar with these kinds of data sets, so I won't dwell on this, but really, when we talk about topographic data and derivatives, in our mind, the point cloud is kind of the raw data product, generally speaking. The individual XYZ laser bounces or points derived from photogrammetric workflows are the source data, but they're also kind of the most unwieldy, hard to use data. And then a lot of people who work in sort of the geospatial world tend to interact with these type of data sets in a raster-based format, so a digital elevation model of some form or a derivative of that digital elevation model. And then there are still subsets of the user base who are very contour-centric. In our world, it tends to be a lot of engineers and those kinds of folks who are looking at these data sets in kind of contour space. But in general, this is the suite of kind of products that we're interested in providing access to and allowing users to dynamically produce. And then sort of what are the applications? So we have tried to sort of provide access to these types of data sets at different levels. So we appreciate that a lot of people, and especially the original motivations for OpenTopography, were that there were not a lot of software that made it easy to use these data sets. If you gave somebody tens of millions or hundreds of millions of LiDAR points, they'd really struggle. And I think that's improved in some ways because a lot of the commercial and open source geospatial packages now have much better support for these kinds of data sets, but they're still kind of unwieldy, as many of you likely appreciate. And so we've tried to build this kind of interactive processing workflow in the browser that allows users to produce the thing they want. And so oftentimes that's a highly derived product from very raw point cloud data. But we've also tried to enable access to these data sets in other ways. So for power users who want bulk download, I want to download a whole data set, we provide a way to do that. We provide access to data in like cloud optimized geotiffs, so you can sort of programmatically interact with data sets. As I said, we have APIs that allow you to kind of script data calls, data access. So we've tried to kind of balance the full range of users of these kinds of data and provide ways for them to get at these data sets at these different kind of levels. So it's about the data, really, fundamentally. And so this is a map of the lower 48. You all probably recognize the coverage here. The green polygons are the USGS 3DEP data sets, point cloud. But also shown here are data sets from the NOAA Coastal LiDAR program. Data sets those are the data sets in dark blue. Data sets in red are data sets for which OpenTopography is kind of the primary archive. Most of these data sets come from collaborations and with other science groups or direct funding from the National Science Foundation. So things like LiDAR data sets collected along the whole San Andreas fault system in California and the Western US is sort of are kind of academically oriented data sets meant to stimulate research. Some of these other data sets that are in red are also collaborations, like Phil, who's on this call, came to us years and years ago to help manage and distribute the first Indiana statewide LiDAR data sets. That's why that one's in red. And then we also have pathways for people to publish data sets collected at a much smaller scale. And so this is what we call our community data space. And it's a pathway for publication of data sets collected from things like drones. So you go fly your DJI Phantom and you collect a photogrammetric data set and you want to publish that because it's associated with a research paper or a teaching exercise or something. You can kind of drag and drop, upload those data sets into our system, and we mint a digital object identifier and make that data set findable and accessible and citable. And so those are the little purple dots on this map. There's 85 trillion points available through OpenTopography that come from mostly LiDAR, but also photogrammetric workflows. And again, the goal being to sort of streamline access to these kinds of data sets without a lot of specialized software or local compute resources. We do a lot of the basic processing for you effectively. The access to the USGS 3DEP data and NOAA Coastal LiDAR, as well as a few other sort of more specialized data sets like the reference model for Antarctica and Arctic DM, are all possible at OpenTopography because these data sets are sitting in public cloud repositories. So this has been a big revolution, I think, and something that the USGS has taken a leadership in. And people like Howard Butler, some of you may know, helped to facilitate this, is all of these data sets now get published into an Amazon public data set bucket. And so we actually dynamically now grab these data sets. So in many cases, OpenTopography holds a copy of the data on our machines at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. But in the case of these very large data sets, we grab them dynamically, and we basically pull them and out of the AWS buckets, and we pass them through our processing workflow and kind of put the value added OpenTopography services on top of the source data. And this has been really, I think, transformational for enabling new and creative ways for people to get at these data sets. So this is, I think, just really powerful, and it's important to acknowledge that this kind of modern way of data management, I think, is really critical. And we're not the only ones who are doing this. There are lots of other groups taking advantage of these open buckets of data that are enabled for programmatic access. So that's kind of the high resolution LiDAR topography data in the lower 48. I'll just mention that we also work with Land Information New Zealand, which is the national mapping agency in New Zealand, and they're running a 3DEP-like program to map all of New Zealand at high resolution. A lot of their processes are modeled on 3DEP best practices. And they came to us years ago and said, can we use OpenTopography to distribute these data? So we distribute their whole point cloud catalog through OpenTopography in a now several year collaboration with them. And they've been a really good partner, and they've produced they sort of stack on top of our work to produce all kinds of nice resources for their stakeholders to enable access. So we have great coverage in New Zealand, which is a cool place, and it's got a lot of spectacular landscapes and interesting geologic processes, which for our core earth science community, that's exciting. And then the other thing that we provide access to that is really not LiDAR focused, or really in general, is these what we call global and regional topographic data sets. So these are things like the Shuttle Radar Topography mission at 30 and 90 meters, NASA DEM, the Copernicus DEMs. There's a whole suite of these kind of data sets. And then also the USGS 3UP raster products, the 1 meter, 10 meter, and 30 meter data sets are all accessible through OpenTopography through both the web portal as well as APIs. And so for a lot of users, in part because this is what they have accessible in their region, these are the data sets that actually get tons of traffic in OpenTopography. We have a very global user base, and a lot of people are pulling this kind of data for their backyard in Africa or Asia or wherever they are. And a lot of our APIs and access mechanisms for these kinds of data sets are baked into other software packages out there. So Blender GIS, for example, has a OpenTopography API call in it to go fetch these data sets. And so this is actually, although not as exciting perhaps to us as the 3DUP LiDAR data sets, this is actually where a lot of the action is right now in terms of global topographic data use. So that's that. One thing just to talk about these data sets before I go into other things is we have this ongoing tension in OpenTopography that's been around since the beginning, but it kind of only continues to grow, which is that OpenTopography is funded by the US National Science Foundation with a very specific mandate to support earth science research and education. But our user base is far broader and more diverse than that. And so we have this kind of ongoing tension about support, and we're providing essentially open geospatial compute to the whole internet, which is not a particularly cheap endeavor. And we're trying to do this on a relatively modest funding base for the National Science Foundation. So we've made some decisions, and those of you, when you go to OpenTopography, will see this. So everything in OpenTopography is free and open accessible to anybody with a .edu email address, because that is the core constituency that the National Science Foundation is interested in supporting. And we also support international academics, K-12 educators in that way. All the global data sets, many of the high resolution data sets, API access at the personal level are all free. But we've gotten to the point where we now have approaching 300,000 registered users, and we've had over 8 million jobs submitted against OpenTopography. And that's a significant resource consumption. And so we've struggled a little bit with sustainability, and how do we keep this thing stable and functional and reliable and still accessible to the broader internet. And so a couple of years ago, last year, we introduced this kind of concept of this subscription-based service. So we call it OpenTopography Plus. It applies to a specific subset of data sets, the 3DUP data, the NOAA data, and these kind of high-resolution polar data sets. And the idea is that commercial users are sort of offsetting the costs associated with utilizing these resources if they value the sort of services that OpenTopography puts on top of these data. Now, obviously, you can go get these data for free from the National Map and all these other places, or you can pull them straight from the AWS bucket. But for some users, this has proven to be the value add of OpenTopography is useful. And so this is something that we'd love to have everything open and fully accessible to everybody, but there are just some practical constraints about the costs associated with keeping the system alive and functional. And so this is something you will see when you go to OpenTopography is you will hit this OpenTopography Plus sign up kind of paywall, so to speak, for certain data sets. So just want to get that out of the way. But coming back to kind of OpenTopography in general and the sort of magic sauce, the secret sauce, the sort of value added thing that we apply to these data sets is really these kind of tools that sit on top of the data for on-demand processing to produce derivatives, to produce visualizations. So we will do things like compute canopy height models on the fly for you. We'll make you contour lines on the fly. We do hydrologic flow routing using a tool called Tau DEM, which is much like ArcHydro. And then the thing I'm going to talk about today, starting just here in a second, is topographic differencing. And so we've got a whole suite of tools that allow you to do intercomparison of data sets inside the browser. We have visualization tools, these are kind of just some GWiz things. U of all, many of you have seen these point cloud viewers. This is the Poetry Viewer, which is an open source tool. It's integrated into OpenTopography, allows users to interact with point clouds in the browser and change their visualizations. This is the Capitol building in Salt Lake, Utah. So this is just one example of kind of the things that users access and make these data easier to deal with. So you don't have to download any software to do this. You just fire it up in your WebGL enabled browser. We make all kinds of raster derivatives and outputs in KMZ file format and browse images and things like that, just to make it really easy to grab and look at these data. And we have users who grab a piece of data and make a hillshade or a slope map and print it out on a piece of paper and stick it on a map board and go out in the field and draw lines on it because they're mapping faults or landslides or something. And so that's kind of that simplified data access workflow that we're really interested in enabling with Crater Lake in Oregon in Google Earth. Hydrologic routing, for those of you who know about this, this is actually one of the not a very heavily used tool in OpenTopography, but in some ways one of the cooler tools, because we've taken TauDEM, which is an open source hydrologic routing toolkit, and we've optimized it to run on a supercomputer. And so you're actually, when you invoke a TauDEM job in OpenTopography, you're actually running on the Gordon supercomputers, which is sitting in the machine room at San Diego Supercomputer Center. And this is supercomputing through a browser, which is kind of cool. So that's kind of the suite of tools inside OpenTopography. That's what OpenTopography is all about. It's about data access, it's about data discovery, it's about easing access to data. And so now I'm going to transition more into this kind of focus on multi-temporal topographic data, intercomparison, call it change detection. We tend to use the term topographic differencing to describe this. And this is work we've been doing now probably for 4 or 5 years, with the goal basically being how do we best utilize the growing availability of these kinds of data sets? So we've become really fortunate, thanks to the 3DEP program and others, that we now have nearly 100% coverage in the lower 48. And places like New Zealand are going to be there, and parts of Europe are getting there. And now we want to obviously start utilizing the second pass, the second collect. So this is a good motivation for why we need to continue the 3DEP program, but it's also a good sort of example of what you can do with these kinds of data sets when this happens, when you have this kind of multi-temporal coverage, whether it's just baseline coverage, like just states reflying every decade, or it's event driven. So this example I'm going to show you here is from the LA County wildfires in January of 2025. So these are these big fires in Southern California, the Palisade and Eaton fires were the largest, most damaging. And we spent a lot of time inside of OpenTopography and the team thinking about basically the methods for how you do topographic differencing, specifically in an on-demand kind of context. A lot about error assessment and how do you better evaluate errors associated with these data sets and try to figure out what is real signal versus what is error in the in the data sets themselves or associated with other things. I'll talk a little bit about error assessment in a few minutes. And then also just physically the data management, like what does the cyber infrastructure look like to enable this kind of thing at scale? Whether it's a lot of people are doing small scale things, but we want to also think about this at large scale, sort of statewide level differencing. So this is La Costa Beach in the Palisades fire. You've all seen these kinds of images, intercomparison, pre-post optical imagery. Fortunately, soon after the fire, so there was pre-existing 3DEP LiDAR data collected in 2016 for this part of Southern California. Immediately after the fire, NV5, as well, in collaboration with this program called Alert California, which is a group out of University of California, San Diego, focused on fire research. They flew post-fire LiDAR data, and this data was made available through the USGS. So thank you to the USGS folks for putting these data sets out there. And so this is now a near comparison of the digital surface model for that same region, where you can start to see the impacts of the fire in a more kind of 2.5 dimensional or 3-dimensional kind of context. And so this is obviously intuitive and easy to look at, but the question is how can you quantify the change here? And so the simple way to do that is to subtract the 2 data sets, right? The pre-event and the post-event. And so what does this look like? And so this image on the bottom is now that subtraction. And you can very clearly see, so red is where the landscape has gone down. So either it's like material removed, erosion, whatever process you want to think about. Blue is the landscape has moved up relative. And so you can see homes that were destroyed by fire. You can also see vegetation changes. You can see houses that were built in that 2016 to 2025 interval that were not impacted by the fire. So these are actually pretty complex maps, but I want you to get familiar with this kind of red-blue color scheme, because I'm going to show you a lot of red-blue color schemes images in the next several slides. So in general, again, red is downward motion, so change in the downward direction, blue is change in the upward direction. So just a quick kind of like topographic differencing kind of 101 here is like, how does this actually work? So you have what we call a compare data set, which is typically the pre-event or the earlier time-stamped data set, and a post data set, which is be the reference. And these data sets, because LiDAR data in general becomes higher point density as the technology has improved, the pre-event data sets tend to be sparser and the post-event data sets tend to be denser. And in general, the older data is not as good as the newer data in terms of errors and other things as well. So what we do is we go back to the points and we create identical rasters of the topography for the 2 time steps in the area of interest. And then we just do basic raster math subtraction. So this is not complicated, really. It's a very simple raster calculator type of exercise. And this gives you the change. And then what is typically done is you do some kind of like error, like masking. So you assume that each LiDAR data collect has a 10 centimeter kind of roughly error. And you could go look at the 3-depth, specs or the QL levels to evaluate this. And then you basically mask all cells within that kind of error budget. So you might say it's 20 centimeters based on 2 10-centimeter error budget data sets integrated. And anything in that 20 centimeters is kind of noise. And everything else is real change. And that's basically how this process works. So it's relatively straightforward. Here are a couple kind of fun examples of this. So this is the Salt Lake City airport, just 2 different LiDAR data collects over the airport. And this one's fun because you can see the planes and the baggage carts and everything else move around on the taxiways, right? So remember, red is where planes were at the first time step, blue is where planes are in the second time step in this example. Here's a natural landscape. This is Yosemite, California, and this is an example of a rock fall, which is a significant hazard in the Yosemite Valley, where 2006 airborne LiDAR collect and a 2010 collect captures this rockfall event. And so in the lower part of this image, you can see the red, which is basically where the rock material was sourced in the upper part of the canyon wall. And then the valley bottom, all the trees are gone because the rocks took them out in the rockfall. And so you see the vegetation change as well. So, and you can see kind of, if you look closely at this image, you can see where the rocks kind of, the initial rock mass source started, where it bounced and moved other rock on the lower slopes, and then where it took out the trees. You also in the background see changes in vegetation and fluvial environments and other things that are happening in that intervening sort of window of time. Here's another urban example from Salt Lake. Again, this just shows urban development and changes. So every blue structure here is new home developments in this kind of suburban development. But you can also, again, if you look closely, you can see where materials being moved on the ground, construction sites, other new warehouses being built, all the things that are moving and changing in this intervening period. So these are kind of some of the examples of just like, when you start differencing these data sets in the vertical, what you see. So not all change in the landscape is vertical, however, and this is one of the other things we spent a fair amount of time on. This is actually computationally, the vertical change is actually quite easy because it's just raster math. There's the devil's in the details. We'll talk more about that. But this is just one approach to doing change. The other way that we do topographic change is what we call 3D differencing. And so this is a more sophisticated approach, more computationally intensive and more specific in its applications. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, but I just wanted to let you know that this exists. So this is an example of 3D topographic differencing from a magnitude 7 earthquake in Japan called the Kumamoto earthquake in southern Japan, 2016. This is a unique event because there was pre and post-event LiDAR that was collected within like a week of each other. It's like one of the most well-captured earthquakes ever in terms of like the aperture over the event. They got lucky that there was pre-event data, and then they got out and they flew it immediately afterward. And this approach, what it's done is it's basically like looking at a dense GPS displacement field where you essentially chop the data set up into like windows of data, the point cloud into windows, and then you basically calculate the best fit to match the data to accommodate the displacement from the earthquake. So in this earthquake, the landscape is translating laterally, primarily. It's a strike slip earthquake. And so the vectors are the magnitude of the displacement, and then the little arrow ellipses are the errors associated with that, and then the colors, the vertical change. And so the way we do this is this thing called iterative closest point, which is an algorithm that comes from actually medical imaging back originally. And essentially what you do is you have these two windows of point cloud data, and you assume that essentially they have not changed their shape. They've only moved in space. And so then you calculate the transformation matrix necessary to backslide the data sets so they match. And then you do this iteratively, and you get the displacement necessary. And then you do this over lots and lots of windows over the chopped up data set, and you get this sort of three displacement field. As I said, this is very cool, but it's also much more specialized because not all change processes are translational, nor are they, can you assume that the landscape doesn't change shape? So this, in general, vertical change is the tool that we use more. It works really well for erosional processes and depositional processes and kind of fluvial landscapes, coastal change like cliff bluff collapse, earthquakes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, urban growth, forest and agricultural land use changes. Those kinds of things are quite apparent in these vertical changes. 3D change detection works far better on some of the things like where, again, the landscape is translating. So kind of earthquakes, strike slip earthquakes are the best example. Slow moving landslides work okay. Sometimes migrating dunes are also good examples. I'll show you a couple of these. But in general, this is a far more specialized approach. And so I'm not going to show you any more examples of this, really. So that's kind of the basics about the process and the methods to do this. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of like the implementation and some of the things we've learned. So we want to take this approach and make it possible for somebody to do it through a browser in OpenTopography. And so you can do this today. It works. The why, you might ask, like one is just to standardize the approach and make it easier for people to do this and to sort of democratize access to these kinds of tools. There's a whole bunch of nitty-gritty about coordinate systems that become really painful when you try to intercompare data sets. And so we can control that. So we can provide tools for users to get the coordinate system transformations right. There's a whole suite of complications about doing this well. So one is related to data quality. And, as I said, old data tend not to be as good as new data. Just algorithm development and writing software that works and does this and is relatively computation efficient, and then just the infrastructure you have to run it on, so the machines necessary to make this possible. So if you're interested in this, there's this Geosphere paper that we wrote a couple of years ago that talk about the basics of how this was done. I will share these slides also afterwards, so you can click these links if you're interested in reading some of these things. And so today you go to OpenTopography and you basically make a selection on the map and you see the data sets that are available in your area of interest. And if there are multiple data sets that overlap one another, we give you the option to click this little button that says differencing and choose to do this process. And so this is an example that we use a lot. This is from White Sands National Monument in New Mexico, where there are 3 airborne LiDAR data sets over this very dynamic dune field. And so on the left is the hillshade of one of those LiDAR collects, and then the map in the middle is the vertical difference. And so in this case, the prevailing wind direction is from the southwest. So the dunes are migrating northeast. And you can see that the material is excavated from the sort of southwest side of the dunes in red and deposited on the north side of the dunes. So that as the dunes move, you can see the sediment transfer in the dune system. On the right is the 3D difference calculation on that same set of data sets. And it's a little less coherent because the dunes actually are changing shape in some way. They relatively maintain their form, but they do change shape somewhat. So this is in OpenTopography today, and you can run these calculations again, assuming that there are two data sets that overlap one another. And as far as we can tell, we've done this exercise. This map may be a little bit out of date, but any place that's black on this map of the lower 48 is a spot that we've identified that has at least two overlapping topographic LiDAR data sets. Not all of these are 3D data sets. Some of these are state. So this was actually done by mining the US IEI, the Interagency Elevation Inventory. And so, but we think it's roughly 30% of the lower 48 you could do this exercise on. You could find two overlapping data sets and you could compute change. New Zealand also has quite a bit of overlapping data, in part because they've had quite a few typhoons and other events where they have done event-driven data collections. And so they have really nice multi-temporal data in some places. The other place, just in general, that there's really good multi-temporal data is in the coastal regions of the United States. If you go look at the NOAA coastal LiDAR catalog, there are in some places like Southern California, the San Diego coastline's been flown once a year going back to like the early 2000s or late 90s. There's really interesting time series, multi-temporal time series, the data sets for that are somewhat geographically restricted because they're just flown along the kind of the bluff edge, but quite interesting. So that's kind of OpenTopography, topographic differencing in OpenTopography. And I'm going to show you now an example of this exercise that we did a few years ago for the whole state of Indiana. And this was an interesting exercise. It's documented in this paper, which if you're interested in this, you dig into this a bit more, but I'll go through sort of the basics here. Just hang on. So there were a couple of like sort of motivations for this, which was primarily like no one had ever done this. No one had ever computed topographic change at this sort of scale and at high resolution. So we did this at 1 meter pixel resolution, and we did it for the whole state of Indiana, wall to wall, in one essentially big scripted data processing routine. So why Indiana, you might ask? One is because Phil, who's on the call, was an early partner. He came to us and asked us to host the 2011 to 2013 Indiana statewide LiDAR data set. So we already had that data. We were familiar with it. And then Indiana had just completed at the time a full 3DEP statewide collect. And so we had these roughly decadally separated in time two data sets. And we were really interested in just like, when you do this, what do you see? Like what's actually in the results? And so I'll show you this here in a second. But just to talk a little bit more about the challenges of doing this. So this is Indiana's a relatively large state. It took a fair amount of compute power to do this, to optimize this. And we were doing it by pulling the data. We did this dynamically by fetching the data from the 3DEP AWS buckets. So there was like some sort of just like coordination and bookkeeping to make this whole thing work. In the end, it produced roughly 4 terabytes of products. We essentially made DTMs, DSMs, canopy height models for the whole state as part of this process. And then we calculated the change in the DTM as well as the change in the surface model. And so one of the interesting things is, what do you see? And so this is the state of Indiana in the digital terrain model. So the bare earth product on the left and the digital surface model on the right. I'll note that if you want to go play with this, we've got all this stuff loaded into a GeoServer, so you can fly around and look at the map interactively at that browsable map URL in the lower right of the slide. And a couple of things immediately jump out at you, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the nuance here in a second. But the primary things when you difference a whole state's worth of data at 1 meter pixel resolution is you see changes in the fluvial and riparian sort of domain. So like, the Wabash River, the White River, these active meandering river systems, you see them changing dynamically in that 10-year period. A lot of the signal, especially in the digital surface model, is seasonality. So whether the LiDAR collect was leaf on or leaf off. And, these large scale statewide collects are really hard to time and get, matched essentially. So you see a fair amount of that. You also see in the state of Indiana a fair amount of quarries and mining activity. So dynamic kind of moving of material around. You also see a lot of the development, urban growth, new housing development. And then the last thing that really jumps out, especially in the digital terrain model, is you see error. And in this case, it's largely flight line alignment error. So you see these horizontal and vertical swaths in the DTM. And those are, as best we can tell, related to kind of kinematic positioning errors in the aircraft trajectories in the initial collect. And we think most of this is in the 2011 to 2013 data set, although we have not fully pulled that apart. So you basically can see which direction each county was flown. Like down there by the White River, it was north-south, but up in the northeast, things are flying east-west. And these are pretty significant errors. And so there's like questions about how do you deal with these and things that we can talk more about. But they really pop out and they're quite apparent. Here are a couple other examples, zooming in a couple of areas. So these are in the Indianapolis area. These are basically changes related to urbanization or housing development. And in the lower example, this is actually a freeway interchange that got rebuilt or redesigned. So these are quite obvious, not that maybe earth-shattering, but it's kind of cool. You can quantify very quickly these things. More interesting as we see things like sinkholes. So in the left, you can kind of see them in the optical imagery and the hillshade, but on the right, the sinkhole growth is actually quite apparent. So this is like another hazard example. Actually, we don't actually know. We should reach out to somebody in India to know how well these are mapped and understood, but you can see them quite apparently here. And so, you see these signals, there's the real thing happening, but one of the things we spent a fair amount of time working on recently, and then this is in part a postdoc who works with us named Cassandra Brigham, who's at Arizona State University, has been working on this problem in particular, and it's part with support from USGS Powell Center that Jason Stoker and some other, Gene Gesh and others are leads on, focused on kind of multi-temporal analysis of topographic data with an eye towards like a future state where there's multi-collects of 3D. And so thinking about error and how do you better understand error? Because as I said, initially, the classic way of dealing with this is you just set a threshold and you mask the pixels that you think are below the sort of error threshold. It's a very simple approach. And so there's a lot of different types of error, different sources of error in these data sets. So, there's georeferencing errors. Those are the swaths that you see in the DTM of the whole state difference, but also down the lower left here, that's a zoom in of what these flight line errors look like. And that's a very vertical swath to swath artifact that has some relatively long wavelength that's due to kinematic positioning of the aircraft, basically drift in GPS quality or GPS position of the plane as it flies back and forth in the survey area. But also horizontal misalignments in the data set will also result in apparent displacements. So, the top of a ridge line in one data set is one plot, and then the post event is slightly shifted, you get apparent change in the vertical by just the horizontal misalignments. As I said before, seasonality of data collection, leaf on versus leaf off, changes in biomass, those things are apparent and show up as sort of error. Classification of the data set, so the quality with which the ground points are classified relative to vegetation and buildings, and also the consistency with which that's done between collects. You've got different vendors, different processing workflows, different algorithms applying to timestamp 1 versus timestamp 2. Those show up as errors in these data sets. And then another really obvious one that is in the devil really in the details here, but can be quite painful, is coordinate reference systems. And this really comes down to metadata and provenance of these data sets, is making sure that we're doing a really good job of documenting what coordinate system data are in, what geoid model was used, if it's a NAVD88 data set, which is it geoid 12, is it geoid 12A, like those kinds of things. We've done a fair amount of work trying to tease this information out of 3D processing reports and metadata, and it's been a little bit challenging at times. And so I think one of the lessons learned from this is that going forward, really, 3UP's been amazing in terms of the QA/QC and the kind of rigorousness with which the data sets have been gone through. But I think just consistency and documentation of these things is something that we can always do better on, and it makes this particular problem a lot easier to deal with. And the other thing I think that this differencing exercise does is it shows you interesting things like the dynamic processes that are occurring both in the built-in and natural landscapes, but it also really teases out data quality. You don't see these swath alignment errors in the bare DTMs in a single time step typically, but when you difference them against another data set, you really see them. And so I think that's another interesting thing here, is that the differencing sort of brings to light some of the issues with these individual data sets. I won't talk much about the error propagation and sort of error work that Cassie has been doing, but in a second I will point you at a webinar we did recently where we talked all about topographic differencing, and this is work that building error models is something that we actually have a manuscript that's in preparation, and so we have some other tools coming soon, the Jupyter Notebook and other things that will allow users to apply these error models, and they'll appear inside of the OpenTopography differencing workflow soon. So that's kind of just like a quick dive on. We can talk a lot more about uncertainty and how to manage these things, but I think it's useful to kind of think about this broadly. So a couple of more just like kind of lessons take home. So this is another example of the Southern California wildfires. This is in Topanga State Park. So same palette. This is also the Palisades fire, but further inland and sort of closer to the source area of the fire. You can totally see here the red is the vegetation burned in the fire relative to the kind of the outside the fire polygon. So the red line is the mapped fire polygon, not from us. This is from the Cal Fire. And it's going to document, there's these call outs point to various things you see when you look at these change maps in detail. But we think, in general, there's a huge opportunity with multi-temporal data. Obviously, 3UP is a critical part of this, and a future continuation and ongoing 3UP initiative will make this possible. It's also great. This particular example is also great motivation for post-event data collection, be able to get out and get data immediately after these large natural events. But it's like a great opportunity just to characterize anthropogenic and natural and change to the anthropogenic and natural landscapes. But the differencing workflows really require that the data are accessible. So they have to be out there. They have to be in a place we can get them, and we have to really get them programmatically because these data sets are large. And they need to be as consistent and well documented as we possibly can. I know this is a moving target. It's a challenge. But it's something that really comes out of this work for us, is just the understanding that these are the places that made this painful and were challenging, were related to some of these basic things about data workflows and processing chains and things like that. And then the other thing that's really interesting is when you do this large scale calculation, like we did it for the whole state of Indiana, it's like each pixel has a signal. There's a change happening all over the landscape. And the question is, how do you figure out which pixels are doing what and what the process responsible for them is? And so one of the things we're working on now is machine learning applied to these change maps. So trying to train the machine to go through and identify, pixels that are sinkholes versus pixels that are new urban development versus, fluvial erosion or fluvial deposition, being able to kind of programmatically produce these maps and then segregate them into a process that's responsible for the change is something that I think is really going to be necessary, especially when we start doing this at really large scale. So if you're really interested in the topographic, I'm getting towards the end here. If you're really interested in the topographic differencing part of what I've talked about and you want a deeper dive, we have a lot of resources online. This opentopography.org/learn/differencing page is sort of the landing page for a lot of this stuff, but done a bunch of blog posts and things like that talking about error and other things. There's video tutorials both on the tools inside of OpenTopography, but also how to use tools like MATLAB to do this kind of processing if you have data and you want to do it yourself. links to publications, and also our GitHub has a bunch of code that's already been developed for this purpose. And then we, as I said before, we did this webinar just last month on topographic differences. This is like a 1-hour dive into some of what I talked about, but a deeper dive, especially on the error part of the equation. So if you're interested in that, I'd point you there. These are these peer-reviewed publications that talk about some of this stuff with their DOIs. If you want to read about some of the work, both the Indiana statewide, as well as kind of just the basic methods and best practices that we've been trying to develop. So yeah, conclusions, I think like OpenTopography has been this really interesting thing in the sense that we all appreciate the value of these kinds of data sets. And so putting all these data sets in one spot on the internet has really driven a lot of interesting use. So there's the academic core community that we support, which is roughly 1/3 of our user base. But there's a ton of people out there using these data sets for all kinds of other things that are quite interesting. And in particular, these like large scale state to national scale data sets present a lot of really interesting opportunities, and as well as challenges that we should all be thinking about how to address. So a little bit of a sales pitch, here at the end is like, we, OpenTopography, we're, as I said, National Science Foundation funded. We would like to have more partnerships. We're trying to build a broader, sort of more sustainable platform, especially given the current political situation and funding threats. This becomes more acute and more pressing, but we've worked with states and other organizations to manage data. So if you've got data sets that you want to be easier to access, we did this with Indiana for the pre-3-depth collects. We've been working with the Yurok tribe recently. We've been doing a bunch of LiDAR collects in Northern California, Southern Oregon, land information New Zealand would be another good example. We've also done some things like worked with Pima Association of Governments, which is the Tucson, the county in which Tucson, Arizona is located, to make the 3-depth data in their region fully open. So this idea of a user needing to subscribe for access, we partnered with them and we removed the subscription paywall for the data sets over Pima County because they thought their stakeholders would value and get value out of being able to use OpenTopography tools to access them. And then we're always interested in these kinds of like larger scale data processing activities as a way to explore and leverage these data sets. If you would like to talk about how to do an Indiana style statewide differencing of your own state or your own county or a region, it would be interesting to talk about that as well. So I'll leave it there. If there are questions, I'm happy to answer them, whether it's through the chat or whatever. I'll let Jordan run the Q&A. And always feel free to reach out to us. We like to answer emails from people, so you can either email me directly. I'm pretty easy to find, but also info@opentopography.org goes to most of the members of the team, and one of us will get back to you as quickly as possible. So thanks again for the invitation. And yeah, appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I know there are a ton of questions that folks have. Well, there's at least one. There's something I always like to ask at the end of these, and that is, what would this work look like without the USGS 3-depth data? How would you be able to do this without it?
You wouldn't, right? These data sets probably wouldn't exist, right? I think 3-depth has really been transformative in the fact that it created this baseline data set that can now be used for post-event response, whether it's the LA County wildfires or it's these just like big statewide initiatives to recollect data sets. We answer a lot of emails from users from other parts of the world, and one of the most common questions is like, how do I get data like LiDAR data from my country or my region? And we're just super fortunate that 3-depth exists and that it's something that has been an investment. And so yeah, I think we're US is sort of a model, and I think it's another important to emphasize that, and both stimulating academic research, which is what we're really focused on, but also we have tons and tons and tons of users of these data that are coming from the commercial sector. So I think there's just a huge impact.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Cool. Abby, what's up?
Yeah. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciate it and enjoyed it. My question, I guess, is about the slide that's uncertainty and vertical differencing. My state, we do vertical differencing all the time for quality control, basically, looking at new collections and whatnot. And so we see the flight line adjustment issues all the time. But we're also finding a few other sensor related type of noise signals and whatnot, and we're learning a bit more with that with our vendor and whatnot. And I'd just be curious to potentially learn more about, and you mentioned a postdoc working with USGS and about some of these kind of systematic errors and quantifying the error. We're hoping at some point, someday, to be able to provide our users more information about how to quantify the sensor and signal uncertainty and error, and how to kind of go about that in a systematic way for all of our different collections. And so do you talk a little bit about that on your page with resources about vertical differencing, or is there a way to be put in contact or talk more about that?
Yeah, I would recommend watching that webinar that is on a previous slide. It's from mine, because I think this webinar at the bottom here with the red arrow pointing at it. And again, I'll maybe somebody can Google that or pull it up and drop it in the chat or whatever. We can make sure, because Cassie does a deeper dive on sort of some of these errors, and basically there are spatially correlated and spatially uncorrelated errors, and sort of trying to develop a model that allows you to better understand the errors in a given piece of topography that you're seeing. We've not spent, like, the specific system errors, related to the sensors and stuff is not something we've dug as deeply on in terms of like trying to pull that out. But, and we know that those flight line alignment errors, for example, are very much related to system configuration, sensor, kinematic positioning of the aircraft. Some of these things are just inherent in these data sets. They are the error budgets in GPS, right? So there are solutions to fix these kinds of things, right? You can do swath to swath alignments. There's tools like the Bayes map, tools that Andre developed that allow you to correct for these kinds of things. I think one of the things that is a challenge. I have some colleagues who have done this kind of exercise to try to correct for those. There was a landslide study done in Minnesota by Steve DeLong, who's at the U.S. Geological Survey, and he actually went through and tried to correct these things. And one of the things he struggled with was getting access to the SBETs, the trajectory files, because it's not something that's typically archived.
Right.
And he had to go back to the vendors and ask them to dig up the SBETs. So it's a little bit hard to find, if you don't have access to those readily, it makes that whole process harder. So there are some practical considerations here in terms of data management. So yeah, if you want to talk more about this, you feel free to shoot me an email or something. I can definitely connect you with Kathy and Chelsea, who have been leading more of the technical development on the differencing work, but it's an interesting topic for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep. Yeah, I see, Jordan, looks like you put the link to that webinar in there, and then there are a whole bunch of other recordings on our YouTube channel from previous talks, because we've been talking about topographic differencing now for quite a few years. So, but I would recommend that. The most recent one would be the one I would start with, because it's the most current.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Abby. Anybody else have questions for Chris? Feel free to drop them in the chat if you don't want to come off mute.
I have a quick question. I'll follow up after Abby. My name is Josh Greenberg. I'm also in Washington State, but I'm the hydrography steward. So we're working with 3D-HP, kind of the derivatives coming from 3DEP data. And I'm curious, in terms of change, how well do you think your change detection would work for predicting changes in hydrography? Without running the model, just looking at the elevation differences, trying to say, okay, yeah, this looks like it would be worth rerunning for 3D-HP or not, and identifying those hydrographic changes that might have occurred, because it seems like that's pretty small and within maybe the errors that you're finding.
Yeah, it's a good. So you're basically saying, like, could you run the change detection on the strictly on the topography, and then use that to intuit where the hydrologic
Yeah,
regimes.
to give an
They're getting
idea of how much,
changed. Yeah.
like how much change have we seen in the rivers in this region? So you could focus a little bit on the river areas, but it does seem like we're talking about small amounts of, you're probably seeing a few feet of gravel change, right? To when a river migrates.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases you see pretty significant. You see meander cutoffs and all those kinds of like more significant changes, but you also see a point bar migration and just in those kinds of processes as well. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like it'd be an interesting thing to like think about. Could you run if you had a framework to do this effectively, you could pull river center lines and then just like run a change detection buffered off the river center line and then try to identify where the topography's changed more than some threshold you define.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think conceptually you could do it. It's not something we've thought about
You haven't
specifically
thought
in that
about.
context,
Okay.
but it would be kind of a cool thing to do, actually. I think. The other thing, like I'm looking at this White River, Indiana, this really pretty picture. This is a relative elevation model. These REMs, Daniel Coe and Washington's. This is the person who started this. We've got some software to produce these, and so these really accentuate the sort of dynamicness of these river systems. So I'm wondering, like, could you compute REM changes? Which is another thing we've never done. Is like calculate the river elevation models and then calculate the change in those river elevation models.
Right. And I think Dan, that's a great way. I think Dan has done that occasionally. Abby might know more, but I recall him doing that. So maybe that is the way, is the REM or a hand calculation first and then look at the change.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting idea, especially because I think the topographic change is not, once you've got the sort of workflow built, it's not that compute intensive, but certainly rerunning the hydrology is.
Right.
And so
exactly.
I can totally see the motivation to do what you're saying, which is use the change to motivate the rerun of the
right. And maybe
models.
Instead of doing a whole Huck 8, you only focus on a few Huck 10s that you have changed.
Have changed. Yeah. No, it's a great idea.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And we've got a message in the chat from Phil. Have you thought about tau ADEM differencing?
Yeah, so that's the hydrologic processing tool that's like ArcHydro or the flow routing. So you're saying, so like the computing change in the hydrologic network, basically. We've not. I suspect that the people who worry more about the sort of hydrologic system maybe have. Like I would go ask David Tarbotton that question, the guy who developed that tool, or there are other people I think who are looking at fluvial systems and changes in fluvial systems, but we've not done that ourselves.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Phil. Any other questions for Chris? Right. Well, this was awesome, Chris. Really appreciate your presentation and taking the time to walk us through what you guys are up to at OpenTopography, especially with regard to topographic differencing. I will make this presentation available on the NSGIC knowledge base within the next week. And I believe, Chris, you'll be sending those slides over, which I will attach. So if anyone wants to share this with colleagues or more broadly, please do. This is a pretty awesome topic, and looking forward to seeing more work out of OpenTopography. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Yeah, thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you want to talk more about these questions. We're always interested in having those conversations.
Well, keep your eyes open for information on the next NSGIC 3DEP for the Nation interest group meeting, looking at end of June or early July, and we'll be talking about platforms for accessing 3DEP data. Looking forward to it, and thanks everyone for joining today.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Chris.